I'm going to read from my prologue, and I'll just say, just to kind of clear the air about the subtitle, and again, we can talk about that more if you want to. But the subtitle, A Life in Four Acts, came from my first Eugene O'Neill seminar that I taught. I'm teaching one this semester. I've taught quite a few. But the very first one, the last session of class in the semester, I call that catharsis. And basically, now this is the students' turn, and they get to say, and I ask them two simple questions. What's your favorite Eugene O'Neill play and why? What's your least favorite Eugene O'Neill play and why? And the first guy that raised his hand said, O'Neill's Life is his greatest play. And his classmates all sort of nodded with him. And I was nodding too. I had, there had been, I suppose, glimmerings of, I had worked so much on O'Neill, glimmerings of the biography, but then it occurred to me, O'Neill's Life is his greatest play, and his greatest plays most often come in the form of four acts. Long Day's Journey into Night is four acts, Iceman Cometh is four acts, Moon for the Misbegotten is four acts, Anna Christie is four acts, it goes on and on and on. And it also occurred to me that his life actually, without any shoehorning, fits quite comfortably into four acts. The exposition, when we learn about his mother's morphine addiction and his first marriage and his first son and going off to sea, and then sort of the rising action as he's discovered as a playwright in Provincetown, which I'll read to you about a little bit, in 1916, ultimately kind of rising to this climax with Strange Interlude, which was probably the height of his career in 1928, when he won his third Pulitzer Prize. And Strange Interlude was actually the play that made the Europeans take note in full strength and put him on the short list for the Nobel Prize, which of course he eventually won in 1936. He's the only American playwright to be awarded that honor to date. And then there's a crisis. And this is the play Days Without End, which is it's an obscure O'Neill play, and there's good reason for that. It's not a very good play. It's wonderful for us biographers and scholars because it tells us a lot about him and about his marriage and about his mother and other things. But it actually ends with the protagonist at the cross in a church shouting that God's love is life, and life is God's love, and of course all of his modernist friends and bohemian artist types were all like, what the hell are you doing? You're the great atheist Eugene O'Neill, and he comes out with this sort of religious play, got absolutely panned, at which point he disappeared from the public eye for 12 years, and the falling action happens there, and then of course his denouement. It is tragic, not because he died, we all die, but the way he died was particularly brutal. And what that was it was a very rare neurological disease called idiopathic spinal cerebellar atrophy. And what that does is it affects your nervous system and makes you convulse without control, but your brain is working perfectly fine. So for the last 10 years of his life, and it's idiopathic, by the way, as many of you know, this means that it wasn't his boozing and his cigarette smoking that did it. There's no cause for it. But for the last 10 years of his life, he was at the height of his creative powers, from the age 55 to 65, and he had all of these play ideas, and he could not get them down on paper. And he couldn't use an amanuensis. He tried using a tape recorder. He couldn't write like that, and so forth. And it was just, American theater history has lost so much because of that disease. Okay. So that's the denouement. The good news is, of course, Long Day's Journey into Night is produced and published in 1956, along with a revival of The Iceman Cometh, and A Touch of the Poet appears, and suddenly Jason Robards and and the director, Jose Quintero, kind of leading the charge. And suddenly, as the Sunday Times of London said, the tallest skyscraper in New York is the reputation of Eugene O'Neill. So there is a kind of journey into light in this tale as well. Although as with many of O'Neill's plays, actually, I do start with a prologue. He does too, sometimes. Like I said, it'll take about 15 minutes to read, and then I'll open it up for questions. That's always the best part anyway. The prologue is called The Irish Luck Kid, 1916. I start with two epigraphs. One is from The Hound of Heaven, Francis Thompson's The Hound of Heaven, famous poem from 1893. And it was really a 182-line poem. I'm not going to read you 182 lines, believe me. But it was clearly O'Neill's favorite poem. And one thing about this, The Hound of Heaven, is that Dorothy Day, many of you know her, the Catholic worker movement person, founder, dated O'Neill when she was very young. She was 19 years old, and they dated for several months. And they were very fond of each other. And O'Neill would recite this poem to a group called the Hudson Dusters, a group of gangsters, and to other bohemians who he hung out with in this bar that I'll read about. And when Dorothy Day heard him read this poem, she decided to go back to Mass for the first time. And the next day, she went back to a Catholic Mass, and she was hooked. And she kept going back and kept going back and kept going back. And lo and behold, but just when Pope Francis came and gave his speech to the United States Congress, he identified Dorothy Day as a servant of God, which I don't know if any of you have heard this, but what that means is that the Pope has made it clear that it's the first step towards canonization. First step of 4. The second one is venerable, I think, and the third is blessed, I think, and then the fourth is saint. And so, there's a classic O'Neill irony, right? The great atheist Eugene O'Neill actually created a saint. Nobody would think that was funnier than he would. Okay. In the Rash, and the prologue, I think I said, it's The Irish Luck Kid, 1916. In the rash, lusty head of my young powers, I shook the pillaring hours and pulled my life upon me, grimed with smears. I stand amid the dust of the mounded years. My mangled youth lies dead beneath the heap. My days have crackled and gone up in smoke, have puffed and burst as sun starts on a stream. And the second epigraph is just 2 lines. It's from Hugh Holland's elegiac sonnet to William Shakespeare in 1623. If tragedies might any prologue have, all those he made would scarce make one to this. Spring, 1916, New York City. Eugene O'Neill, a despondent 27-year-old college dropout and ex-sailor, had spent the last 6 months lost in a whiskey fog of oblivion at a Greenwich Village saloon known as the Golden Swan Cafe. To the regulars, it was the Hellhole, so named after a passerby glanced inside one day and cringed, "This is one hell of a hole." O'Neill felt right at home. The Hellhole sat on the southeastern corner of 6th Avenue and 4th Street, the heart of Greenwich Village, and it served hustlers, pickpockets, prostitutes, bohemians, and the Hudson Dusters, a cocaine-fueled Irish gang that had lorded over the neighborhood for years. If you had a hangover, and nearly everyone did, the 6th Avenue L that passed just outside the front door rattled the 3-story brick building with a head-splitting drum roll. The bar's proprietor, Tom Wallace, hung a massive pair of crossed shillelaghs behind the bar below a photograph of Tammany Hall's Irish-born strongman, Richard Boss Croker. Beer was 5 cents a glass in the back room, where O'Neill would retreat to get drunk in relative solitude in the bar's dark corners, undisturbed by the quivering glow of 2 gas jets mounted on the wall. Patrons rapped on the door 3 times, and a bouncer named Lefty Louie glared through a slat before deciding whether to let them in. Women weren't permitted to smoke in most places in Manhattan, but at the Hellhole they were encouraged to light up. Just the year before, O'Neill had given himself the nickname the Irish Luck Kid, but by now the irony of that roguish moniker had become all too clear. His life to date had been a relentless cascade of hopeless hopes. He was thrown out of Princeton freshman year for poor academic standing and drunkenness. He got married, divorced, and in the process fathered a son whom he still hadn't seen since infancy. He fled the conjugal life for the teeming jungles of Honduras to prospect for gold and instead contracted a crippling bout of malaria. He survived 9 months as a beachcomber in Buenos Aires, working odd jobs, eating scraps, and swilling gin and cheap beer. He contracted tuberculosis, a minor case, yet one that landed him 5 months at a sanatorium. He studied playwriting at Harvard University, but the old man, as O'Neill called his father, stopped paying the tuition after 2 semesters. True, he'd publish a book, Thirst and Other One-Act Plays, but his father fronted the production costs and it hadn't made a dime in royalties. Most painfully, for the moment, he'd just published a poem dedicated to his girlfriend Beatrice Ashe, in which he compared her to Dante's Beatrice. She was in New London, Connecticut, where they had both grown up, and O'Neill was convinced that she was ready to dump him. He was right. O'Neill was antisocial, alcoholic, a heavy smoker. His father was a domineering overachiever, and his brother an underachiever and a world-class drunk. His mother, Ella, had been a morphine addict since the day he was born, all 11 pounds of him. He'd tried to commit suicide. He'd tried to keep writing. He'd failed at both. O'Neill shared a room with a 61-year-old anarchist named Terry Carlin in an unfurnished apartment down 4th Street from the Hellhole, so filthy they called it the garbage flat. Everyone in the village knew Carlin, an unapologetic drinker who held court in the Hellhole's back room and shamelessly sponged off O'Neill, who at the time was living on a small allowance from his father, for as long as he was able. Carlin was able, as it turned out, for nearly 2 decades. Born Terence O'Carolyn in 1855, Terry Carlin was raised in Chicago but had emigrated as a young boy from Ireland, and he looked the part of the rogue Irishman, with his unkempt shock of silvery hair tucked behind the ears, baggy gray suits, and fedora-style hat tilted back on his head as if he were a leprechaun. He spoke rapidly at an unnervingly high pitch and was endowed with preternatural wit. He had the hands of a laborer, but long ago had vowed never to work for money. There's a word for what Carlin thought of puritanical drudges who boasted, as O'Neill's father did, that they never missed a day of work in their lives. Suckers. Few at the Hellhole took Terry Carlin seriously, but to O'Neill he was nothing less than brilliant and among the best-read men he'd ever met. Like O'Neill, he was a self-styled philosophical anarchist, someone who believed in nonviolently protesting against all forms of institutional power, mostly by ignoring them. I am a philosophical anarchist, O'Neill maintained as late as 1946, which means, go to it, but leave me out of it. O'Neill resented his father's unsolicited counsel, but Carlin he listened to. Carlin reciprocated his young friend's respect, though he had his number better than anyone. Every soul is alone, O'Neill would somberly declare. No one in the world understands my slightest impulse. Then you don't understand the slightest impulse of anyone else, Carlin would respond. Hutchins Hapgood, an anarchist friend of Carlin's, rented a summer house in Provincetown, Massachusetts, at the outermost point of Cape Cod, where he and a group of his friends holed up to keep cool and let loose their creative energies. Hapgood and his wife, the writer Neith Boyce, had formed an amateur drama group in Provincetown the previous summer and were actively seeking new talent. O'Neill's yearning for a theatrical breakthrough, some political troubles Carlin was up against with New York's anarchist contingent and the threat of the city's summer swelter combined to make it a good time to leave town. Just got to do a Marco Rubio there for a second. Summer 1916, Provincetown, Massachusetts. Provincetown is situated 50 miles out from the mainland on a continuously fluctuating spit of sand dunes, pine forests, and weathered houses. Land's End, as the peninsula is called, twists up and around on itself like a scorpion's tail, east, north, west, south, and east again. Its harbor has a long tradition of attracting pathfinders, and by that time, the seaside village it protects from the brutal storms of the North Atlantic had become a hothouse of bohemian activity. Over 600 artists migrated there that summer. By August, the Boston Globe would run an article under the headline, "Biggest Art Colony in the World at Provincetown." O'Neill and Carlin, the two wash-ashores as they'd be designated by locals, arrived in late June. Casting their eyes along the curve of the shoreline, the ragtail Irishmen no longer knew which direction they were facing and no longer cared. Sand and sun and sea and wind, O'Neill wrote later of the rolling dunes and seascapes encircling the town. You merge into them and become as meaningless and as full of meaning as they are. There's always the monotone of the surf on the bar, a background for silence, and you know that you are alone. So alone you wouldn't be ashamed to do any good action. You can walk or swim along the beach for miles and meet only the dunes, sphinxes muffled in their yellow robes with paws deep in the sea. But O'Neill and Carlin had a more immediate concern on their minds than the picturesque landscape, their lack of money, and Carlin suggested they put the bite on Hutchins Hapgood for $10. Nestled among an endless procession of gray-shingled houses on Commercial Street, Provincetown's sand-strewn access road, Hapgood's house was located in the arty East End district. Hapgood lent them the money, even though, as he suspected at the time and later confirmed, it would never be repaid. O'Neill and Carlin then temporarily moved into the studio of Bayard Boyesen, an outspoken anarchist they knew from Greenwich Village. O'Neill, with a good word from Carlin, scheduled an audition with the experimental theater group that would soon become known as the Provincetown Players. The reading was to take place at the radical journalist John Reed's house. Most of the players knew Carlin from Greenwich Village, but O'Neill was a curiosity. More unknown then than he's famed now, one of them remembered. They referred to him as the son of James O'Neill, the brilliant actor who'd sold his talent for the easy money of costumed romances and melodrama. Jack Reed loomed large in O'Neill's imagination, even while O'Neill felt an unconquerable desire for Louise Bryant, Reed's future wife. The journalist had gained notoriety 3 years earlier when he covered the Mexican Revolution and embedded for 4 months with the populist Mexican general Pancho Villa and his rebel army. O'Neill, hoping to impress Reed, got to work revising his one-act play, The Movie Man, a vaudeville-style satire based on an actual 1914 Hollywood venture in the Mexican War, during which filmmakers had paid General Villa to let them film his battles. That's true, by the way. On the night of O'Neill's tryout, the brief walk from his new shack on the beach to Reed's cottage across Commercial Street must have seemed like a mile. The daunting assembly gathered there included Reed and Bryant, Hapgood and Boyce, labor journalist Mary Heaton Vorse, playwright Susan Glaspell, director George Jig Cram Cook, Glaspell's husband, set designer Robert Edmund Jones, Provincetown's poet of the dunes, Harry Kemp, and the enthralling red-haired actress Mary Pine, Kemp's wife. The players had been growing restless. They aimed at nothing less than to upend the stale conventions of American theater. Expectations were high over this newcomer, scion of one of the most legendary matinee idols in America. The night was a disaster. For nearly an hour, the players' eyes rolled as O'Neill muddled through The Movie Man. After he'd finished, the group eviscerated the work as frightfully bad, trite, and full of the most preposterous hokum. Later, Harry Kemp scoffed at its abysmal plot. Something about an American movie man who financed a Mexican revolution for the sake of filming its battles. One of the scenes depicted the heroes compelling the commanding generals on both sides, both being in his hire, to wage a battle all over again because it had not been fought the way he liked it. Not only was the story absurd, the script was borderline racist. Reed must have deplored it more than anyone. He knew Mexico and its struggling people well from first-hand reporting. O'Neill knew next to nothing about the country, beyond what he'd learned from barrooms, newspapers, and movie house newsreels, and it showed. O'Neill was highly sensitive to criticism at the time. The editor of the New London newspaper where he'd worked as a cub reporter 4 years earlier remembered young Gene as the temperamental sort who would grieve like a stricken collie if you so much as looked an unkind thought at him. Although surely devastated by his defeat, O'Neill wasn't yet beaten. By mid-July, he was ready for a second audition, this time at Susan Glaspell and Jig Cook's house, where he arrived clutching the script of Bound East for Cardiff, a one-act sea play based on his real-life experiences working on tramp steamers. The same players had assembled, and O'Neill must have sensed a heavy air of doubt. Near prostrate with dread, he sat stock still in a wicker chair and slowly began to read, one of the players recalled, in his low, deep, slightly monotonous but compelling voice. The players listened silently, this time utterly enthralled. There was no one there during that reading who did not recognize the quality of this play, wrote Mary Heaton Vorse years later. Here was something new, the true feeling of the sea. O'Neill's dialogue was written exclusively in seaman's banter and foreign dialects, and his stage directions offered in intimate detail a porthole's view into the stifling atmosphere of the seaman's living quarters. Bound East for Cardiff signaled to the players a radical departure. In it, O'Neill conveyed the sublime power of the sea through a profound sympathy for a working-class type that up to then had been voiceless on the American stage, and, fundamentally, in society at large. We heard the actual speech of men who go to sea, Harry Kemp recalled breathlessly. We shared the reality of their lives. We felt the motion and windy, wave-beaten urge of a ship. This time, no one doubted that here was a genuine playwright. Over the next 40 years, O'Neill would go on to attain 4 Pulitzer Prizes and a Nobel Prize, the only American dramatist to be awarded that honor. Those triumphs and a great deal more can be traced back to that single midsummer evening in a crowded New England cottage where what has to be the most legendary story of discovery in American theater history had just come to pass. Thanks. And I can just say just quickly that, of course, that was the summer of 1916, legendary summer of 1916, which makes this the centennial of America's of Eugene O'Neill's the discovery of Eugene O'Neill as a playwright. Many people say that this really makes it the centennial of modern American drama as we know it today.